She stood beside that throne for 7 years. 7 years of bleeding harvest back into a kingdom that wasn't even hers by blood, fighting his wars, feeding his people, holding the pack together when he was too proud to bend. And the night she expected gratitude, the night the whole kingdom gathered under torchlight to celebrate what they had built together. He walked through those palace doors holding another woman's hand. Not even the decency to hide it. Not even the mercy of a warning. Just Darius Thorncrest in his gold-stitched ceremonial coat, and on his arm, Lady Vivian, smiling like she'd already won. Drop your city in the comments. Let's see who's watching the moment the moon stopped being quiet. The celebration had been Luna Celine's idea. That detail would matter later, would cut through her chest like a blade she'd handed someone herself. But in the early hours of that evening, she hadn't yet understood the cruelty of it. She had spent 4 months lobbying the royal council to reinstate the Moonfire celebration, a tradition Darius had quietly shelved 3 years into his reign, back when the war with the Eastern Territories had swallowed every resource and left no room for torchlight and music, and the kind of collective exhale a kingdom needed to remember it was still alive. The council had resisted. Elder Boren had called it financially irresponsible. Chancellor Vine had used the word frivolous twice in the same sentence, with the kind of emphasis men use when they want a woman to feel the weight of a word. Celine had sat through all of it with her hands flat on the council table and her voice exactly steady, and she had made the case not as a Luna asking for sentiment, but as a strategist explaining leverage, morale, loyalty, the invisible infrastructure of a people who believe their rulers still see them. Darius had signed the authorization on a Thursday morning without ceremony, sliding the parchment across his desk in her direction before turning back to his correspondence. She had not expected ceremony. She had been his Luna for 7 years, and she knew better than to wait for him to look up. The Thornwall Palace had been transformed. That was not an exaggeration. Celine had watched the transformation happen in stages over the preceding weeks, had approved every decision down to the placement of the torches along the inner colonnade, and still, walking into the Great Hall 2 hours before the guests arrived, she had felt something shift in her chest. Not pride exactly, not relief, but something adjacent to both, a kind of vindication that had no clean name. The central fountain had been ringed with pale blue fire, a technique the Reveran Pack's old fire weavers had practiced for generations, the flame burning cold so it lit the water without warming it, throwing light across the vaulted ceiling in patterns that moved like water themselves. The long tables were set in the traditional crescent formation, the oldest arrangement, the one that dated back to when pack feasts had been outdoor gatherings under open sky, the shape and echo of the moon at 3/4. Fresh-cut black pine branches ran the length of every table, their resin smell cutting through the warm air and mixing with the candle smoke and the faint iron and wool scent that Thornwall Palace always carried beneath everything else. The smell of a fortress that had never quite stopped being a fortress, regardless of how many tapestries covered the stone. She had worn the ceremonial gown her mother sent from the Northern Territories when word of the Moonfire celebration reached them. Deep silver, the color of a sky after a storm has moved on, and what remains is that particular shade of clarity that looks like nothing so much as the world having made up its mind. The collar was high and structural, the embroidery down both sleeves her family's old silver and charcoal threadwork, the kind of craftsmanship that took months and could not be faked. She had not asked Darius what he planned to wear. That was not unusual. They had long since stopped consulting each other on the small matters of presentation, and Celine had told herself often enough that this was what maturity looked like in a long partnership. The shedding of the performative rituals, the replacement of ceremony with efficiency. She had told herself this so many times that she had nearly stopped noticing the specific temperature of what she was actually describing. The guests began arriving at the 7th bell. Celine stood at the entrance to the Great Hall with Captain Wren Aldrich at her left shoulder, the head of the Luna's personal guard, a broad-faced man in his late 40s with a scar across his jaw from a border skirmish he never talked about. And she received the arrivals with the particular composure that had taken her years to build. Not distance, not coldness, but a quality of absolute presence that read as warmth and was also a kind of armor, the art of being completely in a room while keeping every important thing in yourself behind a door nobody else could locate. Nobles from the Western Territories, Elder Borin and his wife, the commanders of the three standing packs who owed fealty to Darius, trade representatives from the river towns, healers and craftspeople who had received formal invitation as a deliberate gesture Selene had insisted upon, a signal to the kingdom that the Moonfire celebration belonged to everyone. She greeted each of them. She remembered names. She asked about the grain harvest in the south, about the healer's daughter who had been ill in autumn, about the bridge reconstruction in the river quarter that had been delayed twice. She made every person she spoke to feel briefly, genuinely seen. The hall filled. The pale blue fire moved across the ceiling. The musicians in the upper gallery began the first slow processional. Not a performance yet, just a texture, sound to walk inside of while the night organized itself. Darius was late. This also was not unusual. Selene registered the lateness with a part of her mind that had been registering and filing such things for years, placing it in the long, unremarkable record of his arrivals. He was the king. Kings arrived when they chose to arrive, and there was always a reason, correspondence, a word with his commanders, the particular gravitational pull of his own importance that made time function differently around him. She noted it, set it aside, continued receiving guests. The seventh bell stretched into the eighth. Conversation in the great hall had settled into its comfortable middle density, the point in a large gathering when the room becomes self-sustaining, when the social machinery takes over and no single person needs to be managing it. Selene had moved from the entrance into the hall itself, had accepted a cup of spiced mead she would not drink, was standing near the fountain in conversation with Commander Edessa Vryn, the most senior of the standing pack commanders, a woman with close-cropped gray hair and a battlefield directness that Selene had always respected. When the main doors opened, she knew before she turned. There was a shift in the room's sound. Not silence, nothing so dramatic. More like the subtle recalibration of a crowd that has just perceived something. The fractional lowering of voices, the redirecting of attention. Selene felt it in her shoulders first, the way she always felt the room's mood through whatever tension or release it produced in the people nearest to her, 7 years of reading these spaces having given her a sensitivity to the palace's social atmosphere that was almost physical in its precision. She turned. Darius Thorncrest entered the great hall in his gold-stitched ceremonial coat, the formal alpha dress she had last seen him wear at the border treaty, signing 2 years prior. He was a large man, broad through the shoulders, with the particular physical authority of someone who had spent their entire life having rooms reorganize themselves in their presence. Dark hair worn back, jaws sharp enough to have been constructed for the specific purpose of looking decided. He was the most impressive-looking man she had ever known. She had never confused impressive-looking with good, but she had, for a long time, believed the two could coexist in him. On his arm was Lady Vivienne Krell. The name assembled itself in Selene's mind with a clarity that was almost surgical. Vivienne Krell, daughter of Lord Heron Krell of the Eastern Corridor, a woman 3 years younger than Selene with a reputation Selene had been hearing in pieces for the past 4 months. Fragments dropped in corridors and over meals by servants and courtiers, with the particular careful casualness of people who had decided they would rather not be the one to say it plainly. There had been no plainness. There had only been fragments. Selene had collected them with the same efficiency she brought to everything, had placed them in the same mental file as Darius's late arrivals, and rerouted correspondence and the slow cooling of the space between them, and she had not yet opened that file and read what it actually said, because the knowledge that the file existed was already as much weight as she had chosen to carry at any one time. Vivienne wore red, the specific shade of red that announces itself before the woman wearing it enters the room. Saturated, deliberate, the red of someone who has prepared to be looked at. Her dark hair was arranged with obvious care, her smile directed at the room in general, and Darius specifically, the sideways smile of a woman who knows the geometry of the situation and has decided she is winning it. They were holding hands, not the ceremonial grip of a formal escort, not the practiced proximity of political presentation. Their fingers were interlaced. His thumb moved once against the back of her hand, an automatic gesture, the muscle memory of a specific kind of familiarity, and Selene's body registered the information before her mind had finished processing the scene, a cold, precise knowledge that arrived not as emotion, but as structural fact, the way a foundation registers a crack. The room had seen it. The room was seeing it right now, and the fractional lowering of voices became something slightly more significant. Not silence, still not silence, but a collective held breath, the kind that happens when a large group of people simultaneously understands that they are witnessing something and have not yet determined what the correct response is. Commander Vryn, standing at Celine's left, said absolutely nothing. This was, Celine understood, the most precise expression of loyalty available in this moment. Darius's eyes found Celine across the room. He held her gaze for 2 full seconds. There was something in his face that she could not immediately name. Not guilt, not defiance exactly, but a kind of settled quality. A man who has made a decision and is done revisiting it. He gave a single small nod, the nod he might give to acknowledge a lesser commander at the start of a meeting, and then he steered Vivian toward the far end of the high table. Celine held her cup. The mead inside it was cooling. She stood still for a precise count of 3 seconds. She was aware of every eye in the room that was pretending not to watch her, and she was aware of the ones that were watching openly, and she understood with absolute clarity that the next 30 seconds would be written into this palace's memory for longer than most of what would happen here tonight. She turned back to Commander Vryn. "You were telling me about the Eastern Boundary assessments," Celine said. Vryn looked at her for one moment with the kind of expression that contains a great deal and releases none of it. "The second survey team came back last week," the commander said. "Findings were consistent with what we expected. I'd like to see the full report before it goes to council. I'll send it by morning." They continued their conversation. Around them, the rooms held breath released, the voices recalibrated upward again. The music in the gallery moved into something slightly livelier, and the moonfire celebration resumed its course. Celine moved through the hall for the next hour with the same composed attention she had brought to the early evening, speaking to the healer, speaking to Elder Boren's wife, pausing at the craftspeople's table long enough to ask about the woodcarving commission she had approved for the new southern watchtower. She did not look at the high table. This required a specific kind of energy, not the energy of suppression, which burns hot and visibly, but the energy of redirection, the practiced discipline of placing attention precisely where she chose to place it, a skill she had been developing since she was 14 years old and first understood that a woman who lets the room see her bleed gives the room permission to draw more blood. At the far end of this high table, Vivian leaned close to Darius and said something that made him laugh. The sound of it carried. His laugh was the kind that carried, had always been the kind that carried, and Celine heard it without meaning to, the same way you hear a door close in a room you've been telling yourself you don't need anymore. She excused herself from the conversation she was holding and stepped toward the corridor that connected the great hall to the inner garden. Captain Wren moved to follow her, and she stopped him with one quiet word. "Stay." He stopped. She walked alone. The inner garden was cold and unlit, except for the ambient glow coming through the hall windows, the pale blue light refracting off the frost on the stone pavers, making the whole space look like the inside of something underwater. Celine's breath came out in short, visible plumes. She stood with her back against the stone wall and let herself be still for exactly 1 full minute, the way she had trained herself to do during the worst periods of the Eastern Border War, when there had been no time and no space and no option except to carve out 60 seconds inside herself and let the body remember it was still a body, still breathing, still operational. She was still operational. But something had happened in the last hour that was not covered by that fact, something that was not grief exactly. Grief was slower, heavier, a thing that settled, but rather a specific kind of clarity that arrives only when the last piece of evidence is finally in and there is no remaining argument on the other side. She had known. She had known for longer than she'd admitted, had been choosing, month by month, to operate just inside the border of what she could manage without having to name the whole of it. And now it had been named in front of 300 people, including the standing pack commanders and the royal council and the servants who would carry it to every corner of the kingdom by morning, and the naming had a weight that the private knowing had not. The worst part, and she was honest enough, standing in the cold garden with her breath in the freezing air, to face the worst part, was not even the humiliation. It was this. She had planned this night. She had built this night. The blue fire in the fountain, the crescent tables, the invitations to the healers and craftspeople, the months of arguing with the council, every element of it had been hers. and Darius had walked into the stage she'd constructed and used it to declare something that left her standing at the edge of her own creation, holding a role she had built herself, in a palace that had asked more of her than it had ever given. She became aware that she was clenching her left hand. She opened it deliberately, spread her fingers against the cold stone wall, felt the texture of it. 7 years. In 7 years, she had negotiated 3 border treaties, reorganized the Pact's emergency food reserves during the drought, established the Luna's Council, the first formal body in the kingdom's history that gave craftspeople and healers a voice at regional governance meetings, and personally ridden to the southeastern territories during the fever outbreak, when Darius had sent only a standard relief detachment and the villages were still dying. She had done all of it not because she was required to, not because she was asked to, but because the work needed doing and she was the person who could do it, and because she had believed, had genuinely, structurally believed, that she was building something that belonged to both of them and would be in the long run recognizable as such. She had been building something. She was less certain now of who it had been for. From inside the hall, through the thick stone walls, she could hear the music shift into a faster tempo, could hear the corresponding rise in voices. The celebration she had planned was proceeding exactly as she had intended it to proceed. This was either deeply ironic or deeply instructive, and she hadn't decided yet which. She pushed herself off the wall and went back inside. Captain Wren clocked her return with the eyes of a man whose job it was to notice everything, and who had been practicing that job for 26 years. He said nothing. She walked past him toward the section of the hall nearest the fountain and accepted a fresh cup from a passing server and stood in the blue light and began, with perfect composure, the next hour of the evening she had built. It was Lady Mara Thoss who told her. Lady Mara, wife of Lord Thoss of the River Quarter, was not a cruel woman. This was important, because what she said was not said cruelly. She had been drinking more than usual, which was its own kind of story, and she came to Celine's side around the 9th bell with her mouth pressed together in the specific way women press their mouths together when they are about to tell you something they feel you already deserve to know. She took Celine's arm just above the elbow and leaned in, and what she said was quiet enough that nobody around them could hear it. She was in his private chambers 3 nights ago. 2 of the night guards saw her arrive and saw her leave in the morning. The household knows. Celine looked at Lady Mara. Lady Mara's eyes were doing the thing that eyes do when sympathy is genuine and therefore useless, pooling with an emotion that can't be transferred. "Thank you, Mara," Celine said, and she meant it, and she understood that meaning it was a complicated thing in this particular moment, and she thanked her again, and Lady Mara squeezed her arm and moved away. The household knows. This was a phrase with a specific weight in a palace context. It did not mean whispered between 2 servants over laundry. It meant horizontal spread, the full social membrane of the building, staff and guards and pages, and the kitchen hierarchy all the way down to the yard workers, a dissemination that was, once begun, as complete and irreversible as water and stone. If the household knew 3 nights ago, the noble quarter of the city knew by the 2nd day. If the noble quarter knew yesterday, the merchant streets had it by this morning. The whole kingdom knew. They had all come tonight and watched her receive them at the door of the celebration she had planned, and they had all known. Elder Boren, who had called it financially irresponsible. Commander Vryn, who had told her nothing and said it with perfect precision. The healers and craftspeople she had invited as a democratic gesture, who had watched her with the specific careful attention of people who are watching someone they care about and do not know how to help. The blue fire moved across the ceiling. Celine stood at the edge of the fountain, her design, and she did not retreat, and she did not cry, and she did not leave. She looked at the patterns the cold flame made in the water, and she breathed the pine and candle smoke air of the hall she had transformed, and something organized itself inside her with a precision that was new, a settling that was not resignation but its exact opposite, a decision so complete and structural that it had no excess emotion attached to it, the way the deepest choices never do. She was not going to break. And she was not, she understood now with the same quiet finality, going to pretend. Across the hall and the high table, Vivian was gesturing broadly at something she was saying to the nobleman at her left, her voice carrying the bright self-satisfaction of someone who has been waiting for an audience this size for a long time. Darius was watching her with the specific attention of a man who has been rearranged by proximity to something he believes is new, who hasn't yet understood that the thing he's calling new is simply the familiar thing stripped of the difficulty that made it worth anything. Celine looked at him for the first time since his arrival. He felt it. She saw him feel it. The slight shift in his jaw, the way his shoulders settled differently, the fraction of a second where his attention moved from Vivian to the point in the room where Celine was standing. He met her eyes. She held his gaze for exactly as long as it took him to look away. Then she set down her cup, smoothed the front of her silver gown, and began the slow, deliberate circuit of the room that she intended to complete before the evening ended. A circuit in which she would speak to every commander, every council member, every trade representative, every healer and craftsperson who had come under her invitation, in which she would be everything she had always been and more, precise and warm and absolutely present, so that by the time these people left this palace tonight and compared notes in their carriages and their ships and their long rides back to the territories, the thing they would say to each other would not be that the Luna had been humiliated. The thing they would say would be, she didn't move an inch. She was 3 steps into the circuit when Captain Wren fell in beside her, silent and solid, and she said nothing to him, and he said nothing to her, and they walked together into the room. It was near the 11th bell, the celebration in its final hour, the blue fire beginning to dim as the night's fuel ran low when the page found her. A boy of about 12, one of the palace interior staff, with the wide eyes of someone carrying a message he suspects is important. He stepped into her path and offered the folded parchment with both hands the way the pages had been trained, and Celine took it and opened it without moving from where she stood. The handwriting was Darius's. 3 lines. His handwriting had always been small and compressed, the writing of a man who thought in efficiency. The Eastern Territories delegation arrives at dawn. I will need the council briefing advanced to first light. I expect you to attend. She read it twice. Not, I'm sorry. Not, we should speak. Not even the acknowledgement of what had happened tonight, what he had done tonight, what the entire kingdom had watched him do. Just the next item of business, the delegation at dawn, the expectation of her attendance, her function continuing as required regardless of what had just occurred in this hall. He expected her to continue running. The page was still watching her, waiting to see if there was a reply. Celine folded the parchment. She thought about the 7 years. She thought about the border treaties and the fever outbreak, and the Luna's council, and the crescent tables, and the cold blue fire she had constructed in this fountain, and the 4 months of arguments with the royal council to give this kingdom a night it still deserved. She thought about Darius's thumb moving against the back of Vivian's hand when they walked through those doors, the automatic gesture of long familiarity, and she thought about the household having known for 3 days, and she thought about Lady Mara's eyes doing the thing that genuine, useless sympathy makes eyes do. She looked at the page. "Tell the king," she said, and her voice was steady and quiet and absolute, the voice of a woman who has made a decision she is done being talked out of, that the Luna received his message. The page hesitated, the professional reflex of someone trained to carry return correspondence. "Should I wait for a reply, my lady?" "I just gave you one," Celine said. He went. She stood in the dimming blue light for a count of 2. Then she turned back toward the room, and she completed the circuit, and she spoke to every person she had intended to speak to, and she left the great hall last, after every guest had gone, the way she had always left every room she was responsible for. Last, in possession of what she'd come for, the lights behind her. In her private chambers with the door closed and Captain Wren posted outside, and the palace settling into its post-celebration quiet, Celine sat at her writing table and unfolded Darius's note again. She read it one more time. She set it down flat. Then she pulled a clean sheet of parchment from the drawer, selected the plain working pen she used for correspondence she intended to keep, not the ceremonial quill, the plain pen, the one with ink that dried dark and didn't fade, and she began to write. Not a response to Darius. Something else. A list of names, specific names, with specific notes beside each. The architecture of something she had been refusing to build for months because building it would have meant admitting the need for it. She had admitted the need for it. Outside her window, the city was quiet under a sky that had gone from celebration bright to its natural midnight depth, stars visible now that the torchlight was extinguished, cold in particular and very old. She wrote for 2 hours. When she finished, she reviewed what she had written with the same methodical attention she gave to military assessments and council briefs, checking for gaps, for miscalculation, for the specific wishful thinking that gets people killed in the long game. She found 2 gaps and corrected them. She found no wishful thinking. She folded the document, sealed it, and placed it in the locked drawer of her writing table, the drawer whose key she wore on a cord around her wrist and had never given a copy of to anyone, not even Wren. Then she sat back in her chair and looked at the ceiling, and she allowed herself, in the privacy of this room with nobody watching, the luxury of complete stillness. She was not broken. She knew what broken felt like, had felt it once before, had found her way back from it in the years before Thornwall, before Darius, when the only person responsible for her survival had been herself. She knew the specific texture of breaking, the way it collapses inward, the way you have to let it run its course before you can rebuild. And this, what was happening inside her tonight, was not that. What this was a recalibration. The kind that happens when you have been wrong about the fundamental nature of a situation and you are done being wrong about it, when the evidence is complete and the revision is not painful so much as it is structural, as necessary, and as permanent as setting a bone. She had thought she was building something together. She understood now she had been building something alone. The distinction mattered, not as a wound, she was past wound, but as information. Information changed what you built next. Information changed what you built for. She sat in the silence of her chambers, in the palace she had run for 7 years, in the kingdom that would hear by morning what the king had done tonight, and would be watching to see what the Luna did with it. And she thought about the names on the list in the locked drawer, and she thought about the council and the commanders and the craftspeople and the healers, and she thought about all the years of work that had not been wasted because it had been real work. And real work is never wasted, even when the person you did it beside turns out to be a different shape than you believed. The blue fire in the fountain was gone now. The hall was cold stone and extinguished torches, the tables bare, the pine branches beginning to dry. She had built it once. She could build something else. Sleep, when it came without much ceremony. The practical sleep of someone who has resolved what needed resolving and has a long dawn meeting at first light with an Eastern Territories delegation and a king who had just made the last mistake she intended to absorb. She did not know, as she slept, that the list in her locked drawer had already been partially anticipated by someone else, that one of the names on it had already, in the hours since the celebration, sent a sealed message to a second name on it, and that the second name had already responded, and that the chain of communication she had mapped out in her 2 hours of writing was already moving without her, had been moving for weeks, because some things in a kingdom build themselves around their own necessity. And the woman at the center of it was the last to see the shape of what she'd created. But by the time she understood that, the understanding would be a gift. For now, she slept. And outside her door, the palace breathed around her. Guards in the corridors, fire tenders banking the night hearths, the distant sound of horses in the yard being settled after the celebration. And beneath all of it, quieter than any of it, the specific sound a large thing makes when it begins to shift. 3 floors above, in the king's private chambers, a candle burned in the window until nearly dawn. But by the time that candle went out, it was already too late. The morning would bring the Eastern delegation. It would bring, if the messenger who had slipped out through the palace's east gate 2 hours after the celebration ended reached his destination before sunrise, something else entirely. Something that Darius Thorncrest, for all his gold-stitched ceremony and his careful nod and his settled expression of a man who has made a decision and is done revisiting it, had never thought to guard against. His kingdom had 2 architects. He had forgotten the name of the second one. The Eastern Territories delegation arrived 40 minutes before first light. Celine was already dressed. She had been awake for an hour before the palace began its pre-dawn movement, sitting at her writing table with the plain pen and a second document she had started after the first. This one, a sequence of meeting requests framed as routine administrative follow-ups, the kind of correspondence that would not draw attention from anyone scanning the Luna's outgoing mail, which she operated on the assumption that someone had been doing for at least 3 months. She wrote the requests in the plain administrative language she had developed over years for exactly this kind of communication, specific enough to convey real instruction, bland enough to be ignored by anyone looking for significance. When she finished, she folded and sealed each one and placed them in the courier stack with the ordinary morning correspondence, indistinguishable from it. Captain Wren knocked at the half-hour mark. She told him to give her 5 minutes and used the 5 minutes to check her appearance in the bronze mirror above the washstand. Not vanity, inventory. The silver gown was gone, replaced with the working dress she wore to council sessions, dark charcoal wool, structured, no embroidery. The Luna's seal on the collar brooch in plain silver, nothing ceremonial. She looked like what she intended to look like. A woman who had slept without incident and arrived at a working morning prepared to work. She went out. The council chamber on the East Wing's second floor was already lit when she arrived. The long table with its 7 chairs occupied at the far end by 2 men from the delegation, senior trade representatives. She identified them by the gray road dust on their coats, men who had ridden through the night. And at the near end by Chancellor Vine, who looked up when she entered with the expression of a man who had been hoping for a few more minutes. "Luna Celine," he said, the greeting carrying the specific, careful neutrality of someone who is aware of the last 12 hours. "Chancellor?" She took her seat at the table's center, the Luna's position, and opened the briefing folder that had been placed there. The delegation is short 2 members. The trade minister and his senior advisor aren't present. Vine's eyes moved briefly to the 2 delegation representatives, then back to her. "There was a message this morning. Minister Aldrin sends his apologies. A family matter delayed his departure." "Which family matter?" A pause. The message didn't specify. Celine looked at the 2 representatives. The older one, with the gray beard and the road dust on his right shoulder heavier than his left. A man who had ridden hard and fast and recently met her eyes with a steadiness that told her he was not surprised by the question. "What's your name?" she said. "Corvell, my lady. First attaché to Minister Aldrin." "Corvell, you rode through the night." "Yes, my lady." "The minister's family matter. Did it exist when you left the Eastern Territories?" The attaché held her gaze for a moment. Beside him, the younger representative was watching the table. "No," Corvell said. "It did not." Vine shifted in his chair. "Luna, the agenda this morning covers the river corridor reassessment and the autumn tariff schedule. And if we could—" "We'll get to the tariff schedule," Celine said. She did not look away from Corvell. "The minister sent his first attaché in his place on a matter of this weight. That's a message. What's the message?" Corvell's jaw moved once. He was deciding, she could see him deciding, running the calculation of a man who has come a long distance with information he is not certain of his authorization to deliver, and she held his gaze without pressure, without performance, just the flat patience of someone willing to wait as long as the wait required. "The Eastern Territories Council had a closed session 4 days ago," Corvell said, "before I left. Minister Aldrin attended. The outcome of that session was not formally communicated to my office. But you know what was discussed. I have a reasonable understanding of the primary topic, my lady." "Which was?" His eyes moved once to Vine, came back. "The question of whether the current arrangement between the Eastern Territories and the Crown represents adequate security for Eastern interests going forward." The room was very quiet. Vine's hand was flat on the table and his knuckles had gone slightly pale. Celine closed the briefing folder. "Thank you, Corvell. I'd like you and your colleague to take breakfast in the East Anteroom. Someone will come for you within the hour." Corvell stood. The younger representative stood. They left without ceremony, and the door closed behind them, and Celine looked at Vine. He spoke first, which told her something. "Luna, I want to be clear that whatever you may have heard or observed last night, I haven't said anything about last night." "No, but what I've heard," Celine said, "is that the Eastern Territories Council had a closed session 4 days ago to discuss whether their arrangement with the Crown represents adequate security for their interests." 4 days ago. That's before the celebration. That's not about last night. She opened the briefing folder again, not to read it, to give Vine something to watch her do while she let the next sentence land without theater. "That means the information reached them before it reached me. Which means there are people in this palace who have been in conversation with the Eastern Territories Council about the stability of the Crown's commitments. Without my knowledge and without the Council's formal authorization." Vine said nothing. "Who else is in that conversation, Chancellor?" "Luna, I'm not asking you to give me names you don't have. I'm asking you whether you have names." His jaw tightened. He was a careful man, Vine. A man who had spent 30 years in the palace's administrative machinery by being more careful than the people around him, and his carefulness was genuine, was almost a physical quality, a kind of negative space he maintained around himself at all times. She had respected it for years. She respected it now, but she was done working around it. "I have suspicions," he said finally. "Write them down." She slid a blank sheet from the folder toward him and set her plain pen on top of it. "Now, before this meeting ends." He looked at the pen. "Vine!" Her voice dropped half a register. Not louder, quieter, the way a room gets quieter before something breaks. "The Eastern Territories are looking for a reason to renegotiate their security arrangement with the Crown. If they find one, if someone gives them one, the Northern passes go with them, and if the Northern passes go, the river corridor tariffs are meaningless because we lose the leverage that makes them binding. You know what comes after that. You've been in this palace long enough to know exactly what comes after that." He picked up the pen. He wrote for 2 minutes. When he finished, he folded the paper and she took it without reading it in front of him, placed it in the inside pocket of her coat, and stood. "The delegation will be briefed in 1 hour," she said. "I'll run the meeting. Have the tariff schedules and the river corridor assessment on the table before they return." She was at the door when she stopped. Not for theater. She had genuinely remembered something. "The message this morning from Minister Aldrin, the one about the family matter, what time did it arrive?" "Before the 5th bell," Vine said. "So, before the delegation's riders arrived." A silence. "Before," Vine confirmed. She nodded and went out. The hour between the council chamber and the delegation's return was the most efficient hour she had spent in recent memory. The clarity that had assembled itself in her private chambers the night before, operating now at full function. The locked drawers list running parallel to everything she did in a way that was not distraction, but a kind of structural awareness, the knowledge of the second architecture standing behind the first. She moved through the East Wing with Wren at her shoulder, stopped at the steward's office to confirm the delegation's accommodations would be extended by 2 days. She wanted Corvell accessible, wanted him in the palace when certain pieces began to move, and then climbed to the 3rd floor where the Pack's senior warriors had their common room. She pushed the door open without knocking. 3 men inside. 2 she recognized as senior fighters from the southern border rotation, the 3rd a younger warrior whose name she retrieved after a half-second search. Davan, one of the new tactical cohort, 23 or 24, with a reputation for discretion that she had clocked and filed approximately 8 months ago. They came to their feet when they saw her. "Sit down," she said, and they sat, and she came into the room and stood at the near end of the long table without taking a chair and looked at each of them in turn. "I need to ask you something, and I need the actual answer rather than the politic answer." The 2 senior fighters exchanged a look she caught and did not comment on. The younger one, Davan, was watching her with the flat attention of someone who has not yet decided what shape this situation has. "How is the southern cohort?" One of the senior fighters, Bark, that was his name, broad-shouldered with a scar through his left eyebrow, shifted his weight. "Functional, my lady." That's the politic answer. Bark's jaw moved. He looked at the table for 1 second, then back at her. "Morale is low, has been since the autumn rotation change. The men were told the change was temporary, and it's been 3 months, and there's been no communication about when it ends. Families in the South are running short on the winter allocation. We've had 2 formal complaints filed to the quartermaster and no response." "Who authorized the autumn rotation change?" "Came through the commander's office. We were told it came from the king's direct instruction." Celine looked at Davan. "You're in the tactical cohort." "Yes, my lady." "Have you seen the southern allocation reports for this quarter?" "Parts of them. The full reports go to Commander Edessa." "What parts did you see?" He hesitated. Not reluctance. She could read the difference between a man who doesn't want to answer and a man who is being careful about the precision of his answer. "The distribution ledgers for the first 2 months. There's a discrepancy in the 3rd column. I flagged it to the sub-commander and was told it was a recording error." "Was it?" Davan looked at her steadily. "I don't know. It's possible." "But you kept a copy of the ledger." His expression did not change, but something in the air of the room adjusted, the way air adjusts when something that has been compressed finds a fraction more space. "I keep copies of most things I flag," he said. "Habit." "Good habit." She straightened. "I'd like to see that ledger. Not officially. I'll need it by the end of the day." She left without waiting for a response because the response was already in the room before she asked for it. She had been reading rooms like this one for long enough to know when the ground was ready and when it wasn't, when an ask would land and when it would glance off, and this room had been ready before she walked through the door. That was the thing about the kingdom's underlayer. The warriors, the household, the craftspeople, the healers. It moved at its own pace and by its own logic. And what she had been doing for 7 years, the visible work of the Luna's Council and the border treaties and the fever outbreak response, had been building a reservoir of something that was not quite debt and not quite loyalty, but was the particular combination of both that makes people willing to move when the time comes. She was beginning to think the time was coming faster than she had planned for. She was 3 paces from the council chamber when she heard Vivian's voice. Not raised. That was the thing. A raised voice is an honest thing, gives you the geometry of the space, tells you where the edges are. Vivian's voice was pitched to carry to specific ears and no others, the practiced technique of a woman who understood audience selection, and it was coming from the corridor junction to Celine's left, the one that opened toward the palace's inner residential wing. She ran the whole celebration herself, you know, every detail. Darius barely looked at the plans. A pause. The sound of 2 sets of footsteps. One of them lighter, the quick, precise step of a woman used to moving as performance. I told him she makes herself indispensable, so no one notices how little else she actually has. The woman Vivian was speaking to said something low that didn't carry. Oh, she's not without skill, Vivian said, the kind of concession that puts a floor under the real blow. She's very good at being in rooms. 7 years of practice, but being in rooms isn't the same as being wanted in them, is it? Celine stopped walking. She stood at the corridor junction with the council chamber door 8 feet away, and she stood there and she listened to the entire thing, and her heartbeat stayed at the same measured pace it had been maintaining since the night before. The pace of someone whose body has understood that urgency and speed are not the same thing, that the long game requires a different physiology than the short fight. She stepped around the corner. Vivian was mid-sentence, speaking to a lady in waiting. Celine recognized as belonging to the residential wing staff, young, nervous, clearly regretting the conversation she had walked into, and the sight of Celine brought the sentence to a clean stop. The lady in waiting's face went to a color that was not quite white. Vivian's did not. That was something Celine noted with the same flat attention she gave everything. The woman didn't startle, didn't flush, didn't scramble. She completed the fraction of a second she needed to reorganize and then met Celine's eyes with the particular composure of someone who has decided that attack is a better posture than retreat and who has enough armor on to commit to it. Luna Celine, she said, the title delivered with the specific intonation that makes a title sound like a question about its own accuracy. Lady Vivian, Celine looked at the lady in waiting. Go. She went immediately, the near silent speed of someone grateful to be dismissed. The corridor was empty except for the 2 of them. Vivian held her ground. Her chin was up. She was nearly the same height as Celine, which was not something many women could say, and she used that height the way she used every physical advantage, as a declaration. I wasn't expecting you in this wing, Vivian said. It's my palace, Celine said. I move through it as required. Of course. The smile again. I only meant... I know what you meant. The silence between them had a texture. Vivian was working behind her eyes, recalculating, and Celine could see her doing it, could see the assessment happening in real time. How much does she know? How much did she hear? Which angle do I take? The calculation of a woman who is accustomed to having enough information to win the room and is currently uncertain about her inventory. You should know, Vivian said, and her voice had dropped slightly, shifted register from social combat to something that wanted to read as confidence but was running on something thinner. That Darius and I have an understanding. It's been in place for some time. I didn't come to this palace to disrupt anything. You came to this palace, Celine said, because someone with access to the king's correspondence arranged an introduction through a third party in the Eastern Corridor, approximately 9 months ago. She watched Vivian's expression do something very small and very controlled. I notice you're not asking me how I know that. Vivian said nothing. Because you already know how I know it, Celine said, which means you know what else I know, which means this conversation is a great deal less comfortable for you than you're currently performing. The composure held, barely, the way a wall holds when the foundation is already moving. I don't know what you think you've... I don't think, Celine said. That's not a habit I maintain. She turned to go, then stopped. The same genuine recollection pause she had used with Vine, because something had in fact just connected. She looked back at Vivian. The Southern allocation discrepancy in the third quarter ledgers. Is that yours, or did you have help? The color that had not come to Vivian's face before came now, and it was not the color of guilt. It was the color of understanding that she was standing in front of someone who has already done the math, and the sum has her name in it. She said nothing. Don't leave the palace, Celine said. Not for any reason. If you need anything, speak to the steward. She walked away. Walked. Behind her, she heard no footsteps for a long moment. Then Vivian's steps, fast and directional, moving toward the residential wing. Moving, Celine noted without turning to confirm, toward the king's chambers. Good. Let her run to him. Let her tell him whatever she was going to tell him, however she was going to frame the conversation she'd just had. Darius would hear it filtered through Vivian's telling, which meant he would hear the version that served Vivian's position, which meant he would hear something distorted enough that when Celine eventually showed him the ledger and the allocation records and the name Vine had written on the folded paper currently in her coat pocket, the distortion would be visible and the source of it would be obvious. She had not planned this particular sequence, but she had understood 7 years ago that the most durable plans are the ones with architecture flexible enough to incorporate accidents, that a leader who can only work from prepared positions eventually runs out of positions. She was not running out of positions. The delegation meeting ran for 2 hours. Corvell was a precise man and she gave him the precision back, matched his register exactly, and by the end of the second hour, the Eastern Territories had a revised framework on the table that addressed their security concerns with enough specificity to warrant a formal response from Minister Aldrin in person rather than by proxy, which meant the minister would have to come to Thornwall, which meant the conversation she needed to have with him would happen on ground she controlled. She walked out of the meeting with the revised framework and Vine's folded paper and Davon's ledger, which had been delivered to her between the first and second hours by a page, who had simply set it on the side table without comment or attribution, the quiet efficiency of someone who does a thing and does not require acknowledgement for having done it. She was almost at her chambers when the door at the end of the east corridor opened. Darius came through it. He was not in formal dress. Working clothes, the gray coat he wore for internal meetings, and his expression had the particular set of a man who had decided what he was going to say before he started walking, but is still running the speech in his mind. He saw her, and his stride adjusted. Not slowed, but adjusted, the fractional shift of someone recalibrating approach. They met in the middle of the corridor. The delegation, he said. Handled. She kept her pace toward her door. The framework revision. Vine said you changed the security provisions. I added specificity to provisions that were too vague to be enforceable. The Eastern Territories were using the vagueness as a pretext for renegotiation. She reached her door, put her hand on the latch. Celine. His voice carried the weight of a man who needs something from a woman he has very recently given every reason to give him nothing. She stood with her hand on the door latch and she felt the weight of it, and she let it sit there for 1 full second before she turned. He was 3 feet away, close enough that she could see he had not slept, or had slept badly, the particular grayness around his eyes that she had learned to read over 7 years of sleeping in proximity to a man who carried his problems in his jaw and his temples. What happened last night, he said. The way it happened was a choice you made, she said. I didn't intend. You walked through those doors holding her hand in front of 300 people and the entire palace staff. That's not an accident, Darius. You don't do things by accident. His jaw moved. I should have told you. Yes. I'm telling you now that... What you're telling me now, she said, and her voice was the same quiet register it had been in every conversation today, the voice that was not cold but was complete, that had no space in it for additional information to change its shape, is whatever you decided to tell me on your way here, and I've been listening to decisions you made before you got to me for a while now, so... She opened the door. We have the Eastern Territories framework to finalize by the 4th bell. I'll have my revisions to Vine before noon. She went inside. The door closed. She stood with her back against it in the empty room, and she let herself breathe, actually breathe, the deep pull of air that she hadn't allowed herself in the corridor. Her hands were steady. Her chest was tight in a way that had nothing to do with weakness and everything to do with the specific muscular effort of maintaining containment in close proximity to something that still, after everything, still had the gravity of 7 years attached to it. She did not let it move her. She went to her writing table, pulled out the ledger Davan had sent, and opened it to the third column. The discrepancy was not subtle once you knew to look for it. Allocation funds designated for the Southern Cohort's winter provisions had been redirected through an intermediate account, a noble's administrative account, the kind used for estate management and household expenses, the kind that was filed under personal records and therefore outside standard council auditing. The amount was not enormous in absolute terms. It was large enough, spread across enough entries, to constitute a pattern that had been deliberately designed to look like rounding errors until you assembled all the entries in one place. She assembled them. Then she looked at the account designation, cross-referenced it against the register of noble households she kept in her own files, a comprehensive document she had built incrementally over 3 years and never shared with anyone, and found the account's owner. She sat back. Not surprised. She was past surprise. But the specific quality of confirmation, the moment when a thing you suspected becomes a thing you can prove, had its own weight, its own particular settling. She set the ledger down and sat very still. The name in front of her was not Vivienne's. It was older than Vivienne. It was more embedded than Vivienne, more structural, the kind of name that had been in this palace's machinery longer than she had, longer than Darius had, a name that had survived 3 reigns by being indispensable and invisible in exactly the right proportions. A name that had been redirecting the Southern Cohort's provisions into its own household account for at least 7 months, long enough that the Southern warriors' families were going short in winter, long enough to generate the morale erosion Bark had described in the common room this morning, long enough to build a slow resentment in the pack's core fighting force toward the crown that would, if tended correctly, look like the crown's own failure rather than the theft it actually was. Vivienne had been a distraction, not even a cover, a distraction, something for everyone to watch, including Darius, while the actual architecture was being rearranged behind it. She had been watching Vivienne. She had not been watching this. The cold that moved through her then was not fear. She had made her peace with fear in a much earlier chapter of her life. It was the cold of recalibration. The recognition that the game she was in was larger than the game she had been playing, that the locked drawers list, the careful correspondence, the delegation meeting, all of it was correct, but was also somehow only the outer edge of the actual thing. She needed to move faster. She stood, crossed to the washstand, and looked at herself in the bronze mirror. The charcoal working dress, the plain silver brooch, the face of a woman who had handled the Eastern Territories delegation and walked through 3 loaded conversations before noon and had not lost her position in any of them. The face of a woman who had been building for 7 years without knowing the full dimensions of what she was building against. She reached into her coat pocket and unfolded the paper Vine had written on. She read the name at the top. It was the same name that was on the allocation ledger. Vine had known, or suspected closely enough that the difference was technical. He had written it down when she put the pen in front of him, had been waiting, she understood now, for someone to put a pen in front of him, had perhaps been waiting for a long time. She folded the paper back. She went to the door. "Wren," she said. He was there, had always been there. "My lady, I need you to find Elder Boren, not through a message. Find him in person. Tell him the Luna requests a private meeting at the second bell, and tell him—" She paused, selecting the exact words, because the exact words would tell Boren what kind of meeting this was, and he was old enough and sharp enough to read the register, that she'd like his recollection of the 3rd quarter Noble's Administrative Accounts Review. Wren's face did not change. The 3rd quarter review that officially found no irregularities. "That one," Celine said. He went. She stood in the doorway of her chambers and looked down the length of the east corridor, empty now, the pale winter light through the high windows making the stone floor look the color of old ice. The name on the ledger, the name on Vine's paper. The Eastern Territories Council meeting that had happened 4 days before the Moonfire celebration, informed by someone inside this palace about the instability of the Crown's commitments, the Southern Cohort's morale erosion, the way Darius had walked through those doors last night, settled, decided, done revisiting it, the the specific quality of a man who has been managed into a position and believes he arrived there himself. She thought about the 2 hours she had sat writing at her table last night. She thought about the list in the locked drawer. She had been planning a response to what she understood. She was only now beginning to understand what she was actually responding to. The second bell was 4 hours away. She went back inside and pulled out a new sheet of parchment and picked up the plain pen, and she started over from the beginning, rebuilding the architecture from the foundation up. And the list she made this time was longer and more specific and much, much colder than the one she had locked away the night before. She was still writing when the page arrived at her door, white-faced and out of breath, with a message she did not expect. Elder Boren, the page said, his voice running thin at the edges, had been found in his private study at the first bell. He was not dead, but he was not conscious. And the door to his study, when the steward's assistant had arrived to light the morning fire, had been locked from the outside. The page was still talking when Celine was already moving. She did not run. Running in a palace corridor is a declaration, and she was not ready to declare anything to anyone who happened to be watching from a doorway or a gallery above. What she did was walk at the particular pace that covers ground fast enough to matter while reading, to an observer, as purposeful rather than urgent. The pace of a woman who knows exactly where she is going and has always been going there, which is a different thing entirely from a woman who has just been told that the elder she sent for is unconscious behind a door locked from the outside. Ren was 3 steps behind her. He had heard the page. He had not asked a single question. Elder Boren's private study was in the north residential corridor, the oldest part of the palace, where the stone walls ran thick enough to muffle almost everything, and the corridor torches were spaced too far apart, leaving pools of deep shadow between them that the palace staff had complained about for 20 years without result. It was not a part of the building where things happened by accident. It was the part of the building where things happened when someone needed them to happen without witnesses. The steward's assistant, a young woman, barely 20, with the wide, careful eyes of someone who is working very hard to keep her breathing even, was standing outside the study door when Celine arrived. The door was closed. A palace physician was already inside, which meant someone had moved fast, faster than the page's delivery time should have allowed. Celine stopped. Who called the physician? The assistant's throat moved. The message went to the physician's quarters and to the Luna's office simultaneously, my lady. Standard protocol for incapacitation. Who issued the simultaneous message? She paused. It came from the duty office. I assumed it was standard procedure. It isn't, Celine said. She looked at Ren. He nodded, barely. The communication of 2 people who have worked in close proximity long enough that agreement can be compressed into a single gesture. He would find out who had initiated the duty office message, and he would find out without making the inquiry visible. She pushed the study door open. Elder Boren was in his chair. That was the first thing. He was in his chair, not on the floor, not collapsed against the wall, but seated with the specific careful arrangement of a man who had been placed rather than a man who had fallen. His hands were on the chair's arms, his chin on his chest, his breathing audible from the doorway, slow and thick and labored. The physician, a compact gray-haired woman named Ashla, who had served the palace for 15 years, was crouched beside him with 2 fingers at his wrist, and her face doing the precise, neutral expression of a professional who has formed an opinion and is not yet ready to share it. Ashla, Celine said. Luna. The physician did not look up. He's breathing. Pulse is slow but consistent. No external injury I can identify. What would produce this presentation without external injury? A pause. The physician's fingers moved slightly on Boren's wrist. Several things, she said, and the specific weight she put on the word several told Celine she had already narrowed it considerably. Several things that occur naturally, or several things that require assistance. Ashla looked up then. Her eyes were steady and said something that her professional neutrality was not yet permitting her mouth to say. I'll need to run a full examination, the physician said, in private. I'll be outside, Celine said. She stepped back into the corridor and closed the door and stood with the stone wall at her back, and she thought. Boren had been the name at the top of Vine's list. She had not had time to ask Vine why, had been operating on the inference that Vine suspected Boren of involvement in the allocation redirection. And now Boren was unconscious in a locked room 2 hours after she had sent Ren to find him for a private meeting. And the lockout had been identified, reported, and attended by a physician before the page had even reached her door. The sequence was too clean. Someone had known she was going to send for Boren. She ran the chain back. The only people who had known she intended to speak with Boren privately were Wren, who she trusted with a certainty that was the longest-standing and best-tested certainty in her current life, and Vine, who had written the name on the paper, and whoever had seen Wren moving through the palace toward Boren's wing. She stood in the corridor and she understood, with the quiet, complete knowledge that arrives not as revelation, but as the final piece of a structure clicking into place, that she had a problem she had not fully accounted for. She had been operating on the assumption that her information was more complete than her adversaries, that she was reading a situation they believed she was still unaware of. She had been wrong about that assumption, or had been right about it until some point in the last 12 hours when the balance had shifted, when something she had done had told someone that she knew more than she was supposed to know. She went back through her morning. The delegation meeting contained the Eastern attaché was an unknown quantity, but had no reason to transmit information internally. Vine's paper, Vine himself was the variable, the man who had written the name and was presumably calculating his own position in whatever was unfolding. The conversation with Devon in the common room. 3 men, 2 senior fighters, and a younger tactical officer, none of whom had enough palace access to move information this fast. The conversation with Vivian in the corridor. Vivian, who had immediately gone in the direction of the king's chambers. But the allocation discrepancy, the locked study, the preemptive physician call, these were not things Vivian could have orchestrated in 2 hours. These were things that had been prepared in advance, prepared as contingencies, the infrastructure of someone who had been anticipating exactly this kind of investigation and had set up responses that could be triggered on a short signal. A short signal from someone in the corridor this morning who had watched Celine walk toward the east wing with Wren at her shoulder and had understood from her pace or her expression or the direction of her stride that the investigation had begun. Or a short signal from Vine. She pushed herself off the wall and went back to the corridor junction that connected the north residential wing to the main palace artery, and she stopped at the junction and she made herself stand still and go through it again, stripped of the investment she had in her own assessment. Being accurate, which was the most dangerous thing an assessment could have attached to it. Vine had written the name immediately, without visible hesitation, when she put the pen in front of him. No visible hesitation. In 30 years of palace administration, a man who had survived 3 reigns by being careful about everything, and when she asked him to write down his suspicions, he had written without pausing to calculate. Because he had already calculated. Before she walked into that room, before she asked the question. He had been waiting for the question. She thought about the Eastern Territories delegation arriving 40 minutes before first light. She thought about the attaché Corvel, who had confirmed the closed session only after she had held his gaze long enough to make evasion more costly than disclosure. She thought about the minister's family matter that had not existed when the riders left the Eastern Territories. She thought about the message that had reached the Eastern Territories 4 days before the Moonfire celebration. The message that had told them the Crown's commitments were unstable. The message that had originated inside this palace. Vine had been in every relevant meeting, every council session, every administrative review, every formal communication between the Crown and the Eastern Territories for 30 years. She had handed him a pen, and he had written a name without pausing. It was not Boren's name he had given her. It was a name to send her toward Boren, and Boren was now unconscious in a locked room, and the allocation ledger she was holding pointed at a noble household account. And if that account turned out, when properly examined, when Boren was available to be questioned, to be connected to Boren rather than to the person she had initially assumed, then everything she had assembled this morning would be pointing in a direction someone had specifically constructed for it to point. The cold that moved through her this time was colder than the previous one. She had been given a clean path this morning. Everything had been available. Corvel's confirmation, Vine's list, Devan's ledger, Boren's name at the top. A tidy chain leading to a clear target. In 7 years of actual investigation and actual governance, nothing had ever been this clean. She had been walking a path someone else had swept. She went directly to Vine's office. He was at his desk when she came through the door without knocking. A departure from her usual practice that made him look up with the particular alert quality of a man who registers changes in protocol. His hands were flat on the desk, papers in front of him, the working posture of a man doing ordinary morning work. Everything ordinary. Everything exactly as it should be. She closed the door behind her. Elder Boren is unconscious in his study, she said. Door locked from the outside. Physician on site before the report reached me. Vine's expression did the thing that genuine surprise does. It did not reorganize. It simply suspended, the face holding its previous arrangement while the brain caught up. She watched for the fraction of a second where a performance of surprise would have to construct itself, and it was not there. What was there was the suspension, the genuine pause, and then a very quiet, controlled exhale through his nose. When, he said, discovered at the first bell, reported to me after the second. She came to the desk and stood on the opposite side of it, not sitting, not putting any comfort into the geometry of the conversation. The duty office sent a simultaneous message to the physician and to my office, before the page found me, before any of my people knew where the message needed to go. Vine's hands on the desk were completely still. That means someone monitored Wren's movement to Boren's wing and pre-positioned a response. She put Vine's folded paper on the desk between them. I need you to tell me what this actually is. He looked at the paper. He did not unfold it. He knew what was in it. I gave you what I believed, he said. You gave me what you gave me, she said. Those aren't the same thing and we both know it. So I need you to tell me the difference. Right now, Vine. Not the careful version. The actual version. The silence between them had the specific quality of a man standing at the edge of something he has been standing near for a long time without stepping off. She did not fill the silence. She had learned to wait longer than most people were comfortable with, had learned it from years of sitting in rooms where the person who broke the silence first had already lost the negotiation. He broke it. Boren has been receiving funds from a consolidated account connected to 3 noble households, Vine said. His voice was flat, the voice of a man delivering a brief rather than a confession. Over the last 14 months, irregular payments, small enough to avoid the standard audit triggers. I became aware of the pattern approximately 6 months ago. 6 months, Celine said. Yes. And you said nothing. I did not yet have evidence of where the funds originated. He stopped. That was the reason I gave myself. What was the actual reason? His jaw tightened. For the first time, he looked like what he was, which was a man in his 60s who had survived inside a system by making specific kinds of choices and who was now sitting with the accumulated weight of those choices in a room where the weight had finally become visible. One of the 3 households is Crael, he said. Crael. Vivian's family. Lord Heron Crael, Celine said. Yes. Vivian was not a spontaneous introduction. She was placed. I believe so, yes. To occupy the king. To redirect his attention and his decisions while the allocation funds were being moved and the eastern territories were being destabilized and whatever comes next was being prepared. She was not asking. She was saying it out loud so Vine could hear the shape of it, so he could tell her where the shape was wrong. What comes next, Vine? He was quiet for a moment that she could not afford to fill. There is a formal petition, he said, in draft. I have not seen the final version. But the substance, as I understand it, is a petition to the Royal Council to review the terms of the current reign on the grounds of administrative incapacity. Incapacity, Celine said. The argument being constructed is that the king's recent conduct, personal, financial, indicates a failure of judgment sufficient to warrant a review. The review would be called by a coalition of nobles. With enough council support, it could advance to a formal inquiry. She stood very still. If Boren is implicated in the allocation redirection, she said, he cannot lead a council review. He would be a compromised party. Correct. And if Boren is discredited, the coalition loses its most credible council voice. The petition stalls. Also correct. So whoever built this structure needs Boren to appear guilty before the petition moves, because a guilty Boren discredits the opposition to the petition, and a silenced Boren removes the one council voice with enough standing to block the review from advancing. She pulled out the chair on her side of the desk and sat in it, not because she needed to sit, but because the next part of the conversation required them to be on the same level. Vine, who is the petition addressed to if not the full council? He looked at her. The petition isn't to remove Darius, she said, and she heard herself say it, and the cold precision of it landed in the room like a stone in still water. A straight removal petition needs 3/4 council. They don't have 3/4, not with Boron and his faction intact. but a petition to review the terms of the reign that only needs a simple majority, and if the review finds incapacity, the crown can be transferred. She stopped. To whom? The petition nominates a regent council, Vine said, pending a formal succession determination. Lord Heron Crail is on the regent council. He would be the chair. She sat with that. The whole architecture assembled itself in her mind, in the way that complete things assemble, not piece by piece, but as a single structure arriving fully formed, every element in its relationship to every other element. Crael had introduced Vivian to the king. Vivian had occupied Darius's attention while Crael's financial network redirected the pack's allocation funds, undermined the southern cohort's morale, and destabilized the eastern territory's confidence in the crown. The instability would be documented, attributed to administrative incapacity, and presented to the council in a petition that would advance once Boron, the most credible blocking voice, had been silenced by apparent guilt. The Regent Council, chaired by Crael, would govern during the succession determination, which would take as long as Crael needed it to take. Vivian had never been the operation. Vivian had been the curtain, and she, Celine, had spent the last 12 hours focused on Vivian's name, and on the corridor conversation, and on the interlaced fingers, and the ceremonial coat, and the specific humiliation of the Moonfire celebration that she had planned herself. And she had been so focused on what had been done to her that she had very nearly missed what was being done to the kingdom. She stood up. "Why are you telling me this now?" she said. It was a real question, and she needed a real answer. Vine looked at his hands. Because Boren in a locked room means the timeline has moved. If the petition advances without Boren available to contest it, the review could be called within the week. "And you've been sitting on this for 6 months, she said, and there was something in her voice now that had not been there before. Not volume, not heat, but a quality of contained force. The voice of someone who is being very precise about the amount of anger they are allowing into their words. "And you came to the Moonfire celebration last night, and you sat in that council chamber this morning, and you watched me work, and you let me walk into Boren's wing, not knowing any of this. I didn't know Boren would be—" "No, but you knew the board. You knew the pieces, and you watched me play without knowing what I was playing against." She picked up the folded paper from the desk. This name was misdirection. He didn't deny it. "You were protecting yourself," she said, "keeping your hands off both sides until one of them looked more likely to win." He said nothing, which was the answer. She looked at him for a long moment. He was a careful man who had spent 30 years surviving, and his carefulness had let a kingdom's foundation be hollowed out from beneath him while he kept his records immaculate and his hands clean. And there was something in that which was its own kind of destruction, the quiet, collaborative destruction of people who see clearly and choose, again and again, not to act. She had no time to be angry about it. Anger was an expense, and she was about to need everything she had. "I need 2 things from you," she said, "and I need them before the 4th bell." "What things?" "The full financial record of the consolidated account. Every transaction, every connected household. I need the original documents, not copies, not summaries. The originals with the council seals intact." She moved toward the door. "And I need the draft petition. You said you haven't seen the final version. I'll take the draft." "Luna, I know you have it." She looked back at him. "That's why you've been in your office all morning with papers on your desk instead of running the Eastern Territories briefing the way you were supposed to. You have the draft because someone sent it to you as a signal, as the opening move in a negotiation about which side you were going to be on when this was over. And you've been sitting here deciding." His face was not quite unreadable anymore. Something in it had shifted in the last 10 minutes. Some long-maintained neutrality eroding under the weight of things being named that had been carefully unnamed for a very long time. "I'll have them by the 3rd bell," he said. She went out. In the corridor, she let herself walk at full pace for the first time all morning, because the North residential wing was largely empty at this hour, and pace was now information she needed to carry efficiently more than she needed to carry invisibly. Ren fell in at her shoulder. "Boran," she said. "The physician won't have the examination complete for another hour," Ren said. "But I spoke to the assistant who found him. The room wasn't locked when the assistant went in the previous evening to bank the fire. That was at the 8th bell. So the lockout happened between the 8th bell last night and the 1st bell this morning. During the celebration, or just after?" during the celebration. While the Great Hall was full, and 300 people were watching the king arrive with another woman on his arm and watching the Luna receive it without breaking. While Celine was making her circuit and speaking to craftspeople and watching the pale blue fire dim as the night wore on. "Darius," she said, and she had to decide right now, in motion, in the corridor, how much of what she knew she was going to give the king and when. "Where is he?" "His chambers, as of an hour ago. He sent a message to the council chamber requesting the delegation debrief be postponed to tomorrow morning." Postponed. She processed that. A king who had just attended his own celebration, who had sent her a 3-line note about dawn business, who was now postponing a delegation debrief. Something had reached him this morning, too. Something had shifted his posture from the settled authority of last night to a man who was pulling back from his schedule. He knows something is moving. He may have been told, Wren said carefully. By Vivian. She stopped walking. Where is Vivian right now? A pause. She left the palace. Celine looked at him. 2 hours ago, Wren said, through the north servants' entrance. One of my men saw her go. She was carrying a document case. I told her not to leave. Yes, my lady. The north servants' entrance. Not the main gate, not the noble exit, not any of the monitored passages. The servants' entrance, with a document case, 2 hours ago, which was approximately 90 minutes after their conversation in the corridor, and approximately 30 minutes after the duty office had prepositioned the physician for Boren. Where did she go? Celine said, and she already knew the answer before Wren gave it. Knew it the way you know the last line of a story you have been misreading, the line that reconfigures everything that came before it. Her man tracked her to the outer city, Wren said, to Lord Heron Crail's Thornwall estate. Celine stood in the corridor and she let the full shape of it settle over her, all of it at once. The 7 months of allocation theft and the Eastern Territories' destabilization and the draft petition and Boron in a locked room and Vine calculating his survival and Darius retreating to his chambers while the board moved around him without his knowledge. And Vivian walking out through the servants' entrance with a document case toward the man who had sent her into this palace in the first place and was now apparently executing the timeline he had spent at least a year constructing. She had one move. It was not the move she had planned. It was not careful or structured or built from the architecture she had spent the night designing. It was the move you make when the path you have been walking turns out to have been built for you, when the only way out of someone else's structure is to step entirely off the ground they laid. She needed Darius. Not Darius, the man who had walked through those doors last night with interlaced fingers and a settled expression of someone who has been managed into a decision. Not the Darius who had come to her door this morning with the specific posture of a man preparing an explanation. She needed the Alpha King who had signed the Eastern Territories Border Treaty and the Luna's Council authorization and the Moonfire celebration approval. The man underneath all the management, the man who had built this kingdom alongside her before someone had spent 7 months making him forget that he had. She needed him to see the board, and she needed him to see it before the petition hit the council, which, if Vivian had just delivered the final version to Crael, was now a matter of hours rather than days. She turned to Wren. Get me into his chambers, she said. Not a message, not a request. I need to be in that room. Wren looked at her with the expression of a man who has been in every hard situation she has been in for 7 years and has his own opinion about how the next one is going to go. He has standing orders that the morning is private. Standing orders from who? A pause that was its own answer. Get me in, she said. Now. He got her in. The door to Darius's private chambers opened on the interior study, where the king was standing at the window with his back to the door. His gray working coat, his hands clasped at the small of his back in the posture she had seen 10,000 times, the posture of a man who is looking out at something without seeing it. He did not turn when the door opened. I said I wasn't to be... He turned. His face, when he saw her, did something that she was not going to spend any time reading right now. Celine. Sit down, Darius, she said. We have about 2 hours before your kingdom stops being yours. And I need you to listen to me without interruption for the first part of this, and ask questions in the second part, and I need you to be the man who built this place rather than the man you've been for the last 7 months. He stared at her. Sit, she said. He sat, and she told him all of it. She watched his face move through the stages, the initial resistance, The defensive posture of a man being told he has been handled, which is the most precisely painful kind of information to receive because it requires you to reconstruct your own recent history and find yourself absent from it. She watched the resistance give way to something harder and colder. The face of a man who has just located the specific wound beneath all the other wounds and is finding out the shape of it for the first time. When she finished, the room was very quiet. Darius stood. He went to the window again. She let him stand there for the 30 seconds he needed to reassemble himself, and then he turned, and the expression on his face was one she had not seen in a long time. Not the settled authority of someone who has been managed into certainty, but the raw and particular look of a man who has just burned through everything comfortable and arrived at the thing underneath, the thing that had been there before the management and the obsession and the ceremonial coats and all the rest of it. "I signed something," he said, "last week." Vine put it in with the standard correspondence. "A delegation authorization," he said, "for the Eastern Territories." His jaw worked. "I didn't read it fully." She looked at him. "I need to see what I signed," he said. She already knew what he had signed, and if she was right about what it was, then Crael did not need the petition to clear the council. He already had the king's seal on the document that ended the reign. The document was in Vine's secondary archive. Darius found it himself. That was important, not because Selene needed the gesture, but because he needed to make it, needed to be the one whose hands pulled the parchment from the file and held it in the gray morning light coming through the study window and read the language that had been slipped into the third paragraph of what he had been told was a standard delegation authorization. She stood behind him and said nothing while he read it, and she watched his shoulders, which were the most honest part of him, always had been. The place where what he was actually feeling lived before his face decided what to show. His shoulders dropped about a quarter inch when he reached the third paragraph. He read it twice. Then he set it on the desk with a deliberateness that was the deliberateness of a man choosing not to do the thing his body wanted to do with it. "It's a transfer instrument," he said. "Yes. It transfers administrative authority over the Eastern Territories' border management to a regent designed pending a succession review." He stopped. "There is no succession review scheduled." "There will be one," Selene said. "Crael files the petition today. The document you signed becomes the first evidence of administrative action already in progress. It legitimizes the review retroactively. The council sees a king who has already begun transferring authority and reads it as confirmation of incapacity." Darius's jaw worked. His hand on the desk was flat and very still. Vine witnessed it. "Vine signed everything you signed for the last 3 months. He was positioned as the second signature on all standard correspondence." She came around to stand at the side of the desk, not behind him. She needed to see his face for the next part. "Which means Vine's signature is on enough compromised documents that he cannot testify against Crael without implicating himself. That's why he sat on the information for 6 months. He's been trapped in it." Darius looked at her. The rawness was still there, had not been replaced yet by the worked hardness of a man who has decided on a response. It was the in-between face, the face of someone who is still standing inside the ruins of their own judgment, not yet ready to start moving. She had seen this face on him once before, years ago, after the Eastern Border Campaign when 200 of his warriors had died because of intelligence he had trusted that turned out to be fabricated. He had looked exactly like this for about 6 minutes. Then he had stopped looking like this and started moving. She was counting on the same 6 minutes. "How long?" he said. His voice was low and had a specific quality, the voice of a man asking a question he is not certain he wants answered in front of someone else. "How long have you known?" "The full picture since an hour ago." She held his gaze. "Pieces of it. Longer." "How much longer?" "Long enough that I should have moved sooner." She was not going to give him the softened version. Not now, not with 2 hours on the clock. "I was focused on what was being done to me. I missed what was being done to the kingdom. Those aren't the same investigation, and I ran them as one for too long." Something in his face shifted. Not the grief of a man being absolved, which she had not offered, but the specific change that happens when someone is given honesty at the precise moment they are most suspicious of performance. He looked at her for a moment with an expression that had no name she could put to it, or had too many names at once. "We don't have time for the rest of this," she said. "No," he said. "Crael has the signed document. He has Vivian carrying the final petition draft to his estate. He has Boron neutralized. He has enough council votes for a simple majority if the petition is framed as a welfare review rather than a removal. She put both hands flat on the desk. What he does not have is the original consolidated account records. Vine is getting them. And he does not have testimony from the Eastern Territories delegation, specifically from Corvell, who rode through the night because his minister sent him early, which means Aldrin is not fully committed to Creol's position yet, which means the Eastern Territories are still in play if we move fast enough. Darius straightened. The 6 minutes were ending. She could see it happen, the raw face closing over, not disappearing but going interior, being put somewhere operational, because there are men who can do that, who can take the full weight of what they have cost themselves and the people around them and place it somewhere load-bearing rather than somewhere it just collapses everything. And Darius had always been that kind of man under the management, before the management, and she had been counting on him still being that man underneath. He was. The council convenes at the 4th bell, he said. Creole will file before the 4th bell. Then we need to be there before him. He looked at the document on the desk. Can Vine block the petition's receipt? Not without exposing his own signature on the authorization. And if he tries to block it and fails, he hands Creole a procedural argument about obstruction that plays better than the petition itself. She shook her head. We can't block it. We have to answer it. Answer it with what? With the consolidated account record showing Creol's financial network. With the allocation ledger showing theft from your own pack's warriors. With the testimony of a living elder Boron. She paused. Ashla needs more time for the examination, but Boron was breathing. If she can bring him to the council chamber and condition to speak a single sentence of confirmation, that's enough. Darius looked at her. And if she can't? Celine met his eyes. Then we work with what we have. He nodded once, the nod of a man who has made a decision and is done revisiting it. But this time, for the first time in a long time, it was a decision she had watched him make himself. They went out together. The next 90 minutes were the most compressed of her life. And she had lived through the fever outbreak and the Eastern Border campaign, and the night the council had nearly voted to dissolve the Luna's office entirely. So that was a precise comparison. She and Darius moved through the palace on separate tracks. Him to Commander Edessa and the standing pack commanders, her to Vine and the archive, and then to Ashla and Boron's study. And the palace around them began to change in the way a large organism changes when something in it is shifting, the specific atmospheric change of a building full of people who can feel something moving without being able to name it yet. Vine had the documents. He had more than she had expected. The consolidated account records were complete and damning. 14 months of transactions, 3 noble households feeding into a central account, withdrawal patterns that mapped exactly onto the Southern cohort's allocation shortfalls. A paper architecture so complete that it had clearly been assembled by someone who intended it to be discovered eventually and used, and the question of whether Vine had been building toward this moment or away from it was one she did not have time to resolve. She took the documents. She looked at him. When this is over, she said, we will have a conversation about the last 6 months. I know, he said. She left him there. Boron was still unconscious when she reached his study, but Ashla had the examination complete and her findings were what Celine had hoped for and feared simultaneously. The elder had been given a sedative compound, concentrated, administered in his evening tea based on the cup residue Ashla had been careful enough to preserve. Not poison. A specific, knowledgeable sedation. The kind that required knowing what to use and how much, which was not common knowledge, which pointed towards someone with either medical training or access to someone who had it. How long until he can speak? Celine said. Ashla looked at her patient. With the reversal compound, perhaps 40 minutes, perhaps longer. The concentration was significant. I need him speaking and on his feet in 30. Luna? I know, Celine said. Do what you can. She was in the corridor outside Boron's study, organizing the documents into the sequence she intended to present them, when Ren appeared at the far end of the corridor moving fast, and his face had the specific controlled urgency of a man who is running the information he is carrying against the optimal delivery method before he opens his mouth. Creole is at the palace gate, Ren said, with 12 men. He's requesting formal entry for a council petition filing. 12 men. Not a social call, not a legal visit. 12 men to a petition filing meant he was expecting resistance, or meant he was prepared to provide it. How long to the council chamber from the gate, she said. 15 minutes at formal pace. The fourth bell is in 20. Yes. She looked at the documents in her hands. Vine's account records. Davan's allocation ledger. The transfer instrument with Darius's seal. She looked at Boren's closed door. 30 minutes, Ashla had said, with the reversal compound. The math was the math. She handed the documents to Wren. Get these to Commander Edessa. Tell her to be in the council chamber before Krail arrives and to keep them on her person until I ask for them. Do not go through any staff who weren't personally assigned to the Luna's office before this morning. Wren took them without question. And you? I'm going to the gate, she said. He looked at her with the expression of a man who has run out of things to say that will change the direction of something, and who is therefore conserving his energy for the things he can affect. I'm coming with you, he said. They went. The palace gate was the formal outer entrance, the broad stone arch that opened from the main courtyard onto the approach road, the gate used for official arrivals and departures, the gate under which trade delegations and treaty signatories and royal messengers had passed for 3 generations of Thorncrest reign. Selene had stood at this gate in the rain for the arrival of the Eastern Territories minister, had stood here in summer heat for the border treaty signing, had stood here twice during the war years watching her own people go out, and not all of them come back. She stood at it now, in the gray winter morning, and she watched Lord Heron Krail come through it on horseback, with 11 mounted men behind him, and a document case under his arm. Krail was 61 years old and looked like what he was, which was a man who had spent 6 decades moving inside systems of power, with the specific patience of someone who knows they will eventually arrive at the position they have been building toward. He was not large, not physically imposing, the kind of man who was easy to underestimate until you looked at his eyes, which were the flat, pale eyes of someone who had made and unmade many calculations and had stopped being surprised by any of them. He had gray hair worn back and an expression of complete social composure, the expression of a man arriving for a scheduled appointment. He drew his horse up when he saw her standing in the gate arch. His 11 men drew up behind him. The courtyard was not empty. Selene had not made it empty. The palace household staff were moving through their morning routines. Grooms, yard workers, the bakehouse crew crossing with their morning delivery. And a portion of them had slowed without quite stopping, the instinctive audience forming that happens when the atmosphere of a space announces that something is occurring. She needed witnesses, not because she planned to perform, but because performance and truth look very different to witnesses, and Krail knew it, and knowing he was being watched would constrain the geometry of what he could do here. Lord Krail, she said. He looked down at her from horseback, the specific leverage of height that mounted men use consciously or not. Luna Selene. The title, in his delivery, was not mocking the way Vivian's had been. It was something colder, the courtesy of a man who does not need to mock because he believes he has already won. I have business with the Royal Council. I'll ask you to clear the way. The council convenes at the 4th bell, she said. You're early. A petitioner may arrive before the bell. He was already moving to rein around her. That's a matter of council procedure, not Luna's discretion. You're right, she said, which is why I'm not here about council procedure. He drew up again. The eyes moved to her, recalculating. I'm here, she said, because there are 12 men who have ridden with you to a petition filing, and the standing arrangement between the crown and visiting noble parties restricts armed escort to 4 within the palace precinct for any purpose other than a direct royal invitation. She looked at the men behind him, unhurried, the way you look at a thing you have already counted. You have 12. That's 8 over the arrangement. A pause. One of the 11 behind Krail shifted his horse. This is not the moment for procedural games, Krail said, and the social composure had thinned very slightly, the paper over the calculation becoming less opaque. I have a document to file. I will file it. You'll file it with 4 men, Selene said, or you'll wait outside the gate until the arrangement issue is formally reviewed, which takes 3 council members and a sitting scribe and will run past the 4th bell. She let a single beat land. Your choice. The courtyard was quiet. The household staff had stopped moving. In the gateway above, she was aware of two of Ren's men positioned without fanfare, their presence not threatening, just present. The silent arithmetic of a Luna, who had been running a palace for 7 years and knew where her people needed to be. Krell looked at her for a long moment with the flat pale eyes of someone doing very fast math. He had 12 men, and she had Ren's guard, and the procedural argument, and an audience that would carry every detail of this morning's gate encounter into the palace's permanent memory. And he was a man who had spent 60 years inside systems of power, which meant he knew exactly what it cost to force a confrontation in a space someone else has organized. He looked past her, toward the palace doors, and something moved across his face, quick and controlled, but she caught it. The specific shadow of a man checking for something he expected to see. Vivian, she understood. He was looking for Vivian, who had been carrying the final petition draft to his estate and was supposed to have ensured something by now. Some piece that was supposed to be in place, and was not. She filed that. 4 men, Krell said. He turned to the nearest rider. Wait at the outer wall. He did not look at Celine again as he rode forward. She stepped aside and let him pass, because blocking him was not the game, and she needed him inside the building and seated in the council chamber when the documents arrived with Commander Edessa, when Darius walked through the council doors on his own authority, when Boren, she was counting on Ashla, was trusting Ashla's 30 minutes, when Boren arrived capable of saying the single sentence that would unravel the entire structure. She turned and walked back into the palace ahead of him. The council chamber filled in the way council chambers fill before something significant. The specific density of bodies and controlled breathing, and the smell of wool and candle wax, and the particular human heat of a room full of people who are all managing what they know and what they don't know simultaneously. 7 council members took their seats. Commander Edessa stood at the far wall with the documents inside her coat, her face the face of a battlefield commander who has been told to hold a position and is holding it. Chancellor Vine sat at the administrative desk with his hands folded, the specific stillness of a man who has finally made a choice and is now simply waiting to see what it costs. Krell entered with 4 men and took a position at the petitioner's table. His composure was complete again, the social calibration restored, the brief unsteadiness at the gate already gone from his surface. He set the document case on the table and opened it without drama. The 4th bell rang. The council is in session. The head council member, Elder Sorens, Boren's deputy, a thin-faced man of about 50, who had been waiting his entire career for this chair and looked like he was only now realizing what sitting in it would actually require, announced. His voice was steady. A petition has been presented for council receipt. Lord Heron Krell of the Eastern Corridor. The council will hear the petition statement of grounds. Krell stood. He was very calm. He had the calm of a man who has been preparing a specific speech for a very long time. The grounds... The chamber door opened. Every head turned. Darius Thorncrest walked in without announcement, without ceremony, without the formal herald introduction that protocol required for a King's Council entry, in his gray working coat with his jaw set and his eyes moving once around the room and settling on Krell with an expression that was the most completely present she had seen on him in 7 months. Behind him, supported on one side by physician Ashla, and walking with the careful, deliberate step of a man whose body is not yet fully where his will is, was Elder Boren. The chamber held its breath. Boren looked like what he was, which was a man who had been sedated against his will and was operating on reversal compound and whatever iron the decades had laid into his spine. His face was gray. His eyes were completely clear. Krell's composure did not break. But something behind it did. She could see it the way you see ice change before it cracks, the surface holding while the structure underneath lets go. Lord Krell, Darius said, and his voice had the full register of a man who has burned through everything soft and arrived at the foundation. You are in my council chamber. I am filing a petition, Krell said. That is my legal right, and I intend to... Commander Edessa, Celine said. Edessa pulled the documents from her coat and placed them on the council table. The council will review, Celine said, the consolidated account records of a financial network spanning 3 noble households, 14 months, and a total sum redirected from the Crown's Southern Pack allocation. She looked at Krell. One of those households is yours. The chamber was very quiet. Krell looked at the documents. His 4 men were behind him, and Ren's people were at the door, and Darius was standing 12 feet away, and Boren was standing on his own feet, barely, but standing, and the council members were looking at the documents and looking at Krael and looking at each other with the specific rapid calculation of 7 people simultaneously revising their understanding of what they had walked into. "This is a fabrication," Krael said. His voice was controlled. "A desperate fabrication by a Luna who has lost her king's confidence and is attempting to—" "Elder Boren," Celine said. The room went to Boren. The elder stood with Ashla's hand at his elbow, and he was gray, and he was barely upright, and his voice, when it came, was the voice of a man using the last available authority of his body to say the thing that needed saying. "The consolidated account," Boren said, and the words came slow and deliberate, each one placed like something being nailed down, "was presented to me 4 months ago as an investment vehicle by Lord Krael's estate manager. I was told it was a legitimate nobles cooperative. I signed a single authorization." He stopped. His chest moved with the effort of what he was doing. "I did not know what it was funding. I was not informed. I have the original authorization letter in my personal archive. It shows who presented it and how it was described." The silence in the chamber had a specific quality now, the silence of a large mechanism whose gears have stopped. Krael looked at Boren. His pale, flat eyes did something that was not quite anything she had a name for. Not rage, not fear, but the expression of a man who has spent 60 years calculating and has just found a number he did not account for. He picked up his document case. "I will not stand here," he said, "and be subjected to—" "Sit down." Darius's voice was not loud. It did not need to be loud. "Or I will have you seated." 3 of Ren's people were at the chamber door. Krael looked at them. He looked at Darius. He made the calculation of a man who has lost his position, but has not yet lost all of his pieces. A man who is already, Celine could see it happening, reorganizing toward the next move. He sat, and Celine, looking at him, understood with the clean, cold certainty of someone who has been in enough rooms with enough dangerous people that sitting did not mean surrendering. That a man like Krael, seated in a council chamber with his document case still on the table, and 3 noble households still behind him, and the petition still technically unfiled, was not a contained problem. He was looking at her. Not at Darius, not at Boren, not at the documents, at her. And in his eyes was not defeat. It was the specific assessment of a man who has shifted from one game to another, who has decided in the last 30 seconds that the game he came here to play is over, and the game he is now playing has different pieces and different stakes, and has not yet fully declared its rules. She had been in this chamber for 20 minutes. She had not yet seen Vivian, who had taken a document case through the servant's entrance 2 hours ago. Vivian, who had gone to Krael's estate and should have returned by now, or should have sent word by now, and had done neither. Vivian, who had been in this palace for 9 months and had learned its architecture and its access routes and its staff patterns with the particular thoroughness of someone who had been instructed to learn them. She turned to Ren quietly. The motion contained within the larger movement of the room's attention on Krael and Darius and Boren and the documents. "Where is Vivian?" she said. And Ren's face, for the first time in 7 years of standing beside her through everything, showed her something she had never seen on it. He didn't know. Ren not knowing was the coldest thing that had happened all morning. In 7 years, she had never seen that expression on him. Not in the border campaign, not during the fever outbreak, not in any of the hard situations that had assembled themselves around her life in this palace and required 2 people who trusted each other completely to navigate. He was a man who made it his professional obligation to know the location of every relevant piece on the board at all times, and the fact that he was looking at her right now with an honest blank was not a gap in his competence. It was a signal that Vivian had moved through a channel Ren's network did not cover, which meant a channel Celine had not known existed, which meant there was still a door in this palace she had not found. She turned back to the room. Krael was seated. His document case was on the table, and his 4 men were behind him, and his pale eyes were moving between her and the council members and the documents with the specific, unhurried quality of a man who has decided the council chamber is no longer the primary theater. Darius was standing with his arms at his sides and his jaw set, the full alpha posture, the one that filled a room without requiring the room's cooperation. Boren was in a chair that Ashla had produced from somewhere. the elder's color still bad but his eyes fully clear and tracking everything. The petition, Elder Soren said, because he was the head of the session, and protocol required him to say something, and what he had available was the procedural frame, has not yet been formally presented. Lord Crail, do you wish to— I withdraw it, Crail said. The chamber absorbed that. Not surprised, too loaded a word for what moved through the room, more like the specific recalibration of 7 council members who had arrived expecting one situation and were now being asked to process its opposite. The structural adjustment of people whose preparation has been made irrelevant. You withdraw, Soren said. The petition is withdrawn pending further consultation. Crael's voice was entirely composed, the voice of a man making a business decision at a business table. No excess emotion, no admission of anything. He picked up the document case. I reserve the right to refile. You will not refile, Darius said. Crael looked at him. The first direct engagement between them since Darius had walked through the door, and Celine watched both men hold it, watched the specific tension of 2 people calculating the distance between what can be said in a council chamber with witnesses and what exists underneath the sayable. Your Majesty, Crael said, with the courtesy that is not courtesy at all, but its complete opposite delivered in courtesy's clothing. I am a legal petitioner exercising my council rights. Whatever the Luna has assembled this morning— The Luna, Darius said, and his voice dropped a register in the way that very large men's voices drop when they stop managing their weight, has assembled the last 7 months of your activity in my kingdom, which I have read. He took 2 steps toward the petitioner's table. You will not refile. You will present yourself to Chancellor Vine's office before the 6th bell with your full estate accounts for the last 14 months, and your estate manager will be available for council examination. Crael's jaw moved once. This is not a legal instruction. You cannot compel— I can compel a great many things, Darius said. Most of them I have chosen not to use because I was operating on counsel that turned out to have an author. He stopped at the edge of the petitioner's table and looked down at the document case. Where is Vivian? The question landed in the room and sat there. Crael's eyes moved, not to a person, not to a door, but to the middle distance, the involuntary movement of someone whose internal calculation has just hit an unexpected variable. It was the first uncontrolled thing she had seen him do, and it was small, half a second, but it was real. Lady Vivian's movements are her own concern, he said. Lady Vivian is your daughter's school companion, Celine said. You've known her family for 11 years. You introduced her to this palace through a mutual contact in the Eastern Corridor approximately 9 months ago. She came to stand beside Darius, not behind him, beside him, the position she had held at his left shoulder for 7 years of public appearances and council sessions and border negotiations, the position that was hers by 7 years of work, and was hers today, regardless of what the last several months had looked like. She didn't come back from your estate, which means she isn't coming back, which means you told her not to. Crael said nothing. Which means, Celine said, that whatever she was carrying in that document case was not the petition draft, or was not only the petition draft, because you don't send your primary instrument out of the palace on the morning of a council filing unless you're using the filing as misdirection for the actual move. She looked at him. What is the actual move, Lord Crael? The pale eyes came to her and stayed there. You've been thorough, he said, and the way he said it was not a compliment and was not quite a threat, but was the specific acknowledgement of a man who respects the quality of an opponent's work in the same breath as he tells them it isn't enough. 7 years in this palace and you've learned to read a room. That's genuine. He stood, picking up the document case with the care of a man who maintains his habits because his habits have kept him alive. But there are rooms in this kingdom you haven't read yet, Luna, and what's in them has been in them since before you arrived. He turned toward the door. Hold him, Celine said. Ren's people at the door didn't move dramatically. They simply occupied the space the door required, the efficient geometry of trained men who don't need to display the thing they're willing to do. Crael stopped. The document case, she said. A pause. The room held its breath. Crael looked at the door, at Ren's men, at the 7 council members watching with the fixed attention of people who understand they are witnessing something that will be in the palace's record for a generation. Then he set the document case on the table. She opened it. The petition draft was there, as expected. 40 pages, clean language, the specific legal construction of something that had been refined over many months by people who knew exactly what they were building. Beneath it was a second document, sealed, the seal unbroken, addressed in a hand she didn't recognize to a name she did. The name was Lord Van Thorn of the Northern Territories, the most powerful independent territory lord in the kingdom. A man who had never formally aligned with any crown faction, who controlled the northern passes that the Eastern Territories' security arrangement depended on, who had been neutral for 3 reigns, and whose neutrality was the single most valuable political commodity in the kingdom's current geography. Creole had not been filing a council petition. He had been delivering a letter. The petition had been the event everyone would be watching, the council chamber, the formal filing, the king's response, the Luna's documents. While Vivian walked this letter out through the servant's entrance to Creel's estate, from which it would have been dispatched to the Northern Territories by the fastest rider available before anyone in this palace understood that the actual game was the Northern Alliance, and the council petition was the noise designed to cover the sound of it. She looked at the unbroken seal. She looked at Creel. "You were going to offer Van Thorn the Eastern Territories border management," she said. The transfer instrument Darius signed. "You were going to hand Van Thorn legal authority over the northern access routes as part of a coalition arrangement. And in exchange, Van Thorn backs the succession review." She set the letter down. "With Van Thorn behind it, you don't need 3/4 council. You don't need a simple majority. You have the territorial authority to call a review on independent grounds." Creole looked at her for a long moment. "You should have been a strategist," he said. "I am a strategist," she said. She picked up the letter, walked to the chamber's fireplace, and dropped it in. The sealed document caught and held and burned with the specific clean finality of parchment that has been well dried, the flame blue-edged in the morning cold, and Creole watched it burn with the expression of a man watching 60 years of careful work arrive at a destination he had not planned for. When the letter was ash, Celine turned back to the room. "Council," she said, addressing the 7 members who had been watching all of it, with the focused attention of people who understand their function. "Lord Creole will be remanded to the palace's East Holding Suite pending a full examination of the consolidated account records and the transfer instrument filed under the king's seal. The examination will be conducted by an independent tribunal of 3 council members and Chancellor Vine." She looked at Sorens. "Elder Sorens will chair." Sorens, who had been waiting his entire career for this chair, looked at it differently now. He straightened. "Confirmed," he said. Creole was taken by Ren's people without incident. He walked out of the council chamber with the same composure he had entered it, the 60 years of discipline holding in his posture and his face, and she watched him go and felt not triumph. Triumph was too light a word and the wrong shape entirely, but the specific quality of a thing that has run its course, the particular exhaustion and clarity that arrives when a sustained effort meets its resolution. The chamber emptied by degrees. Darius remained. Boren, in his chair, looked at Celine with the clear eyes of a man who has been brought back from sedation and is running on reversal compound and will need to sleep for 12 hours when this is over. "The authorization letter," he said, "in my archive, for the consolidated account." "We'll need it for the tribunal," she said. "You'll have it." He paused, the labored pause of a man managing his breath carefully. "I should have asked more questions when Creole's man came to me. I knew it, and I chose convenience." His jaw tightened. "That's on me." "Yes," she said. "It is." He looked at her with something that was not quite surprise and was actually closer to respect, the respect of an old man for a woman who does not soften the accounting when the accounting is owed. "Fair enough," he said. Ashla took him out. The chamber was empty except for her and Darius, and the documents on the table and the ash in the fireplace. The 4th bell had long since passed. The gray winter light through the high windows had shifted from morning pale to mid-morning flat, the kind of light that is not beautiful and not dramatic but is simply honest, the light of a day that has decided to be what it is. Darius was standing at the window, the same window position he had used in his private chambers 2 hours ago. She understood it was where he stood when he was processing, when the thing he needed to think about was too large to think about while looking at the room. She gathered the documents from the table and organized them in silence. She was very tired. Not the tired of physical exertion, but the tired of a sustained high-frequency attention that has been running for, she calculated, Approximately 18 hours since she had stood in the inner garden the night before and felt the cold stone against her palm and decided not to break. "Vivian," Darius said. His voice was quiet and had nothing performed in it. "She'll surface," Celine said. "She has no remaining function in Crael's operation and no reason to stay hidden. When she surfaces, the tribunal will want her testimony. Will she give it?" "Vivian is pragmatic," Celine said. "She'll give whatever testimony protects her position. With Crael remanded, her position is best protected by distance from him." A silence. "I was," he said, and stopped and tried again. "I was not." He stopped again. She waited. "I knew something was wrong," he said finally. "Not what. But I knew. I could feel it the way you feel weather coming, that specific pressure, and I chose to be occupied." His jaw moved. "That's the honest version." "Yes," she said. "It is." He turned from the window. His face was the face of a man who is done with the version of himself that chose occupation over attention and is not yet certain what the next version looks like, and is honest enough to stand in the in-between without filling it with performance. She had not seen this face on him in a very long time. She had not been sure it was still available. "I don't know how to ask you for what I need to ask you for," he said. "Then don't ask," she said. "Not today." He looked at her. "Today we finish the tribunal setup and get Van Thorn a message before Crael's rider does and brief Commander Odessa on the Southern Cohort allocation correction." She picked up the documents. "Tomorrow is soon enough for the rest." He looked at her for a long moment with the specific attention of a man who has seen something he had stopped seeing and is finding it both worse and better than he remembered. Worse, because the seeing requires acknowledging the not seeing. Better, because the thing is still there to be seen. "All right," he said. She went out. The weeks that followed had the quality of a kingdom reassembling itself after a storm that has taken the roof off. The same structure, the same walls, but the interior exposed and rearranged, certain things revealed as less durable than believed, certain things revealed as more. The tribunal ran for 9 days. The consolidated account records held. Crael's estate manager offered a reduced accounting in exchange for testimony, gave the tribunal the full construction of the financial network, including the connection to 2 of the 3 noble households that Celine had not been able to directly confirm from the allocation ledger alone. The 3rd household's representative attempted to destroy their own records and was found doing so by a palace archivist who had been, on Celine's quiet instruction, monitoring the noble records room for exactly that kind of traffic. The attempted destruction became its own evidence. Vivian surfaced on the 4th day, presenting herself at the palace gate in a hired carriage with her personal belongings and a palace solicitor she had retained from the city. She was not arrested. She was examined by the tribunal for 2 full days, her testimony confirming the 9-month timeline of her introduction to the palace, the instructions she had received from Crael's household about the nature of her role, and the document case's contents on the morning of the council session. She gave the testimony with the specific, pragmatic precision of a woman who has assessed her options and chosen the one that preserves the most of her future, and the tribunal recorded it without editorial commentary, and when it was over, she left the palace in the same hired carriage and was not seen again in Thornwall for a very long time. Whether she had loved Darius, whether anything in the 9 months had been real and not constructed, was a question the tribunal did not ask, and Celine did not ask, and Darius did not ask aloud, though she suspected he asked it in private, in the gray coat at the window, in the specific quality of late nights she was not present for. Some questions do their work on a person without requiring an answer. Sometimes the asking is the point. Crael was stripped of his Eastern Corridor estate management and his council seat. The financial network was dissolved and the redirected funds were returned to the Southern Pax allocation. Not as a political gesture, but as a corrective accounting. The math made right because the math was wrong. And wrong math, left standing, becomes the foundation of the next wrong thing. Celine drafted the reallocation order herself and sent it to Commander Odessa for execution without routing it through the standard noble approval channel, because the noble approval channel had 3 members connected to the compromised households, and she was done routing things through channels she hadn't personally cleared. The Eastern Territories sent Minister Aldrin in person 10 days after the council session. He arrived in the daylight through the main gate with a standard escort and a formal apology, which was not a common diplomatic instrument, and was delivered with the specific care of a man who understands the value of an uncommon gesture at a precise moment. Selene received him in the council chamber with Darius present and the revised framework on the table, and the meeting lasted 4 hours and produced a security arrangement with enough specificity to be actually enforceable, and enough flexibility to survive the next administration change without requiring reconstruction. Aldrin, as he was leaving, stopped at the door. "Corvell said you read him in the first 5 minutes," he said. "Corvell made it easy," Selene said. "He's a precise man." "He is." Aldrin paused. "For what it's worth, Luna, the Eastern Territories have been watching you work for 7 years. Some of us were watching closely." He gave a nod that was more than a nod. "The kingdom is better run than its recent events would suggest." She received that without performance. "I know," she said. He left. Vine kept his position. This was a decision that was not simple and was not unanimous. Elder Boren, once recovered and restored to his council seat, argued for removal with the focused intensity of a man who had been sedated against his will and had opinions about the people who had allowed the conditions for it. Selene heard the argument and sat with it for 3 days and came back to the council with a counterproposal that Boron, to his credit, did not immediately refuse. Vine would retain his administrative function under a dual review arrangement in which all correspondence of substance required a second council signature before filing. It was a constraint, not a restoration of full trust, and Vine accepted it with the expression of a man who understands the difference and has made his peace with it. Trust, she had understood for a long time, is not a binary. It has grades and conditions and specific contexts in which it applies, and the mistake is treating it as all or nothing, which produces either naive overextension or the complete withdrawal that leaves you operating alone in a palace full of people you refuse to use. She was done operating alone. She had been doing it for too long and calling it strength. And it was strength, up to the point where it became something else. A kind of voluntary isolation that served her self-sufficiency more than it served the kingdom, and the kingdom was what she was here for. It was the 4th week after the council session when she and Darius had the conversation she had told him to wait for. Not in his chambers, not in the council room. In the inner garden, the one she had stood in the night of the moonfire celebration, with her back against the stone wall and 60 seconds of deliberate breathing. It was still cold, the frost still on the pavers, but the morning light was different from winter's flat gray. The particular light of a season beginning to change, not arrived, but on its way. The light that has decided something without yet declaring it. They stood near the fountain. The pale blue fire was gone, had been gone since the night of the celebration. The fountain was just water now, ordinary winter still water with the morning light on it. "I've been trying to find the right words," Darius said. "There aren't right words for this," she said. "There are just words." He was quiet for a moment. "I stopped seeing you," he said. "That's the—" He stopped. "Everything I've tried to say comes out as an explanation, and I don't want to explain it. I want to name it. I stopped seeing you, not because you became invisible, because I chose to look somewhere that was easier than looking at the thing you were holding up for both of us." She looked at the water. "The thing you were holding up," she said, "was genuinely heavy." "I know. And I held it because I chose to," she said, "not because you couldn't. I made a decision early in this that I would carry the weight that needed carrying regardless of whether you were carrying with me. And that decision made me useful and also made me invisible in a way I participated in." She turned to look at him. "I'm not absolving you. I'm not. What you did at the celebration, the way you did it, that was a choice, and it had a cost, and the cost was real. But I've spent 7 years being the person who holds things without asking for help, and then being surprised when people stop asking if I need it." Darius looked at her for a long time. His jaw was working in the way it worked when he was holding something that wanted to be something other than words. "What do you need?" he said. "Right now. Not as your king, just what do you need?" She thought about it honestly. Not the perform pause, not the strategic calculation, but the real question answered by the person underneath all the architecture. The person who had stood in this garden in a silver gown and breathed and decided, and who had been running on that decision ever since. "I need this to be different," she said. "Not repaired. Different, because what we had before wasn't broken by Crael or by Vivienne. What we had before had been wearing thin for a long time, and we both let it. And I'm not willing to go back to something that was already becoming something I couldn't sustain. He held her gaze. Different how? I don't know yet, she said. I know what I don't want. I don't want to be the person who runs the kingdom while the king is occupied. I don't want to be the person who holds the weight that nobody else wants to hold and calls it partnership. She looked at the fountain water. I want to actually be seen, not appreciated, not valued, not acknowledged, seen. The way you see someone when you look at them and you know who they are and you're not afraid of what that requires. The garden was very quiet. Somewhere beyond the palace wall, the city was beginning its mourning. I failed at that, he said. Yes. I don't know if I can promise I won't fail again, he said. I'm not going to make that promise because I don't know if it's true, and I'm done saying things to you that I haven't checked for truth first. She looked at him. But I can tell you, he said, that I see you right now, standing in this garden with the frost on the ground, and everything you have done in the last month, and everything you have held for 7 years, and everything it cost you. I see all of it, and I am... His voice did something it rarely did, which was carry something unmanaged, something that had not been organized before it arrived at his mouth. I am aware of what I almost lost. Not the Luna, not the political partner, you. I'm aware of what I almost lost. She stood with that. It was not resolution. It was not repair. It was a man who had burned through everything constructed and arrived at what was underneath. And what was underneath was real enough to stand in. And she was not certain yet what she would build on it, or whether it would bear the weight she'd need to place on it, but it was real. And she had spent enough years in rooms full of performed things to know the difference. She did not tell him it was enough. She did not tell him to hope. She said what was true, which was the only thing available. Then we'll see, she said. He nodded, not the settled nod of a man who has arrived at certainty. The nod of someone who has been given a chance they understand the cost of and is choosing to be honest about not knowing whether they can meet it. It was the most honest thing she had seen from him in years. She walked back inside ahead of him, back into the palace she had run for 7 years. Through the corridor that connected the garden to the east wing, past Wren at his post at the corridor junction, who gave her the eyes of a man who has been in every hard situation beside her, and whose understanding of the current one did not require words. She went to her writing table, writing. She pulled out the list from the locked drawer, the list she had written in 2 hours on the night of the Moonfire celebration, the architecture of a response to what she had understood at that time. She read it through once, the whole thing, every name and note in her plain pen's dark ink. Then she folded it and set it aside. She pulled a new sheet of parchment. She picked up the plain pen. She sat for a moment in the quiet of the morning, in the room that was hers, in the palace she had built into something, and she thought about what comes after a storm. Not the drama of it, not the moment the roof comes off, but the specific quality of the days after, when you are standing in the cleared space and the damage is visible, and the question is not what you have lost, but what you are going to build with what remains. The answer, she understood, was never the same building. You do not rebuild what fell. You build what you know now, which is always different and always harder and always more honest than the thing before it, because the storm has stripped the assumptions, and what is left is only what was true. She began to write. Not the list, not the architecture of response and defense and political survival. Something else. A proposal to the Royal Council for the expansion of the Luna's Council to include the Southern Pact's warrior families as formal representatives, with a defined budget and a defined channel to the King's administrative office. A structural change, the kind that outlasts the people who make it, the kind of thing that does not require the goodwill of any one king to survive because it has been written into the governance itself. She had been doing the work for 7 years. It was time to write the work into the walls. She wrote for an hour. When she finished, she read it through with the same methodical attention she had always given to things that mattered, checking for gaps, for places where ambiguity could become a later argument, for the specific wishful thinking that makes people write what they hope rather than what they know. She found 2 gaps and corrected them. She found no wishful thinking. She sealed the proposal and wrote Commander Odessa's name on the outside and placed it in the morning courier stack and pushed back from the desk. Through her window, the city was fully awake now, the sounds of it carrying, the market quarter, the river district, the bakehouse and the forge, and the 1,000 daily sounds of a kingdom running its ordinary life. She had heard these sounds from this window for 7 years, and they had been background for most of that time, the ambient evidence of a world continuing while she managed the mechanisms that kept it continuing. Today, they sounded different. Not louder, just more present. The sounds of people who had been fed through a winter that could have gone much worse, whose warriors' families had not lost their allocation, whose Luna had sat in a corridor near the east wing and read a ledger by plain penlight and decided quietly and without announcement that the work was worth doing because the people it served were worth serving. She did not think of herself as particularly good. Goodness, in her experience, was not a fixed state but a direction. The thing you face toward on the days when facing it cost you something real, not the days when it was easy or rewarded. She had faced it on days that cost her real things. She expected to face more of those days. She was not afraid of them. She was tired still, in the deep way that does not clear with a night's sleep but requires something longer, weeks, maybe, of ordinary days and ordinary work, the restoration that only comes from a long absence of emergency. She intended to have those days. She intended to insist on them, which was itself a new thing. The insistence, the understanding that she was not a mechanism that ran on whatever fuel was available, but a person who required the specific maintenance of rest and time and space to be something other than useful. She stood and crossed to the window and looked out at the city she had tended. It was not hers. It had never been hers in the sense of belonging to her, which was the wrong kind of possession anyway, the kind that makes people do the things Crael had done and the things Darius had done, and the small daily version of those things that everyone does when they mistake custody for ownership. But it was hers in the other sense, the sense that matters more, the sense of something she had given real work to and would continue giving real work to, not because it was required of her, or because it made her necessary, or because she had nowhere else to be, but because the work was real, and the people were real, and the realness of it was enough. The morning light through the window was the light of a season coming. Not arrived yet. On its way. She watched it for a moment, the city in that particular light, and then she turned away from the window and went back to her desk and picked up the next piece of correspondence in the stack and opened it and began to read. Because there was work, and the work continued, and the continuing of it was, in the end, the whole point. The kingdom that had watched its Luna be publicly dishonored on the night of the Moonfire celebration and had held its breath to see whether she would break, that kingdom would spend the next several months watching something they did not have an immediate word for, something that was not triumph and not vindication, but was closer to the specific quality of a foundation that has been tested and has held. They would watch the Southern Pax warriors receive their corrected allocation. They would watch the Luna's Council expand its membership. They would watch the Eastern Territory's revised agreement produce its first stable quarter in 2 years. They would watch, and they would talk. In the carriages, in the markets, and the long rides between territories, and what they would say to each other was not that the Luna had won. It was something quieter than that, something that required more words to say than most people reached for, something that had to do with the specific kind of strength that doesn't announce itself. They would say she was steady. In a kingdom that had just discovered how many of its foundations were not, steady was the word that meant everything. And in the inner garden of the Thornwall Palace, in the winter that was becoming something else, a fountain held still water in the morning light, and the cold blue fire that had burned in it on the night everything changed was gone, and what remained was simpler and clearer and true. It was enough. It was, in the end, exactly enough.